Welcome to the first Travels in 10 Minutes, where we give people a platform to talk about some of the unique places they've visited, whether it was the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, countries you can't go back to these days because they don't exist, or today's Middle East, or say the stands like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Pakistan. This podcast strives to take people back to see what they recall of the old days, the pre-European Union, with the borders up, the pre-Euro currency with the francs and the liras, and before the wall came down. Today we have a great guest. Bertie Glemis has been around the world, and I'd like to say thank you and welcome Bernie Glemis.
Hi, Brent. Thanks for inviting me. I love the theme of the show. I think it's a great
Wonderful.
idea.
Thanks for being my first guest. I know you've had some amazing travels, and they're particularly unique because you got to go behind as an adult, you got to go behind the Iron Curtain and see it firsthand from the other side. You had to go through Checkpoint Charlie, I believe. So, do you want to talk about that trip and?
Sure, sounds good. Why don't I give it some context to start with? So I was 24 years old when I left Canada for this trip. I decided to go on a backpacking trip of Europe. I've got a French background, so I got relatives in France. And my father, who was alive at the time, had been in the Second World War, and his brother was in a French POW camp. So we had some history revolving around the Second World War and Berlin as well, where my uncle had spent time in Spandau prison, which I only found out afterwards. But the point is, before I left, my father took me by the arm and he said, "If you're going to Europe, just promise me you're not going across the Iron Curtain." So, of course, within a couple of weeks, I was across the Iron Curtain. And the way I got there was not your typical way. I went through from Sweden. I was in a hostel, and I realized that the and there happened to be an Eastern Bloc person, a person from Poland at the time, which was in the Eastern Bloc, in the dorm room in the hostel with me. And when I mentioned it to somebody else, he jumped into the conversation and said, "You go to Berlin, I give you a ride to Berlin tomorrow." I said, "Okay, great." So he had escaped Poland when there was, I'm not sure exactly what it was. It was 1982, if I remember right, and the Russians stepped things up in Poland somehow. There was some kind of invasion or something, and he had left under machine gun fire, apparently, him and two other families, and some of them ended up in Sweden. That's why he was in Sweden. So the point is, we took the ferry across, an East German ferry, where there was a spy following us on the ferry from Sweden to East Germany. And when we got to East Germany, I'm just going to,
Sure.
I know we got a limited time, so I'm going to just touch on some kind of interesting things that happened. I had a long telephoto lens, which comes into play later in the story as well. And I started taking pictures of the shoreline as the boat was arriving. And he just freaked out. "Don't take pictures of the shoreline. It's military secrets," this kind of thing. And I thought, oh, okay. So then we went through, and we got stranded on the highway going in. So what they did when you got into the country, they stamped your passport with whatever kind of mode of transportation you took. So in our case, it was a little boat, and it was said to be the hardest stamp to replicate, to falsify in the world at the time, because it was multicolored rubber stamp, and it showed the time and the boat on the stamp. And along the road, which is about a 3-hour drive, if I remember, from the northern shore of East Germany to Berlin, to the wall, and so we pulled into what would be a truck stop kind of place on the highway to get a bite to eat. And then when we left, the car stalled, and he was freaking out because they measure the time that it takes you to get from the border to Berlin. And if there's a gap in time, then you're under suspicion of having done something nefarious, right? And he was he was in Berlin on not as legal situation as he could have been because he had escaped and all that kind of stuff. So he was trying not to get
Absolutely.
kind
Yeah.
of noticed and brought back to Poland. His wife was there and his newly born kids were there. And so anyway, the other part of it, now, one of the reasons I tell this story is for context, because Berlin was surrounded by enough barbed wire to
Wow.
go around the world something like 2 or 3 times. So the city of Berlin was surrounded by, and so we got to the first set of barbed wire, or the wall, I guess, and then we checked in there, and then we went further in, probably about, I can't remember at this point, maybe it was a 10-minute drive, something like that, before we got to the actual border with the city. So what that means is that there was about there was kilometers of wall. The wall was kilometers wide all the way around the city. So it wasn't just like hopping a fence. It was like hopping a fence and running for half an hour and then hopping another fence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not that anybody would be going that way. They would be going more the other way.
Exactly. Yeah. From inside out.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So did you get to use?
so
Sorry.
we went through, we got through. Now, so again, in context, so the country of West Germany, the country of East Germany was beside West Germany, of course. Berlin was in the center, and it was surrounded by all of that barbed wire. And then it was divided into 3 zones, one of them being the British, the French, and the Americans, that had their own zones in the western part of Berlin. And then the wall went through the city and divided it from the Russian part of Berlin. Okay. Which, when I was there, was being patrolled by helicopters and all kinds of things. So it was interesting. Now, I was staying in a hostel again, and I ran into a couple of people from the UK. They were very straight-laced, probably private school kids, very, how would I put it, underexposed, let's put it that way. And they mentioned going to Berlin. I said, I want to go to Berlin, to East Berlin as well. So we decided to travel together. There's power in numbers, and who knows what's going to happen when you're going across into one of those places, because their laws are quite different, and they're you never know what's going to happen. Let's put it that way. So it was best to be with somebody than be alone. And so we got in. We went through Checkpoint Charlie, and of course, me with my camera, I started taking pictures of it. Once I got through, I started taking pictures of the guards, and of course had a flood of guards running after me to take my camera away. And but luckily, I was able to keep the pictures, which is good. So I got a few pictures. They were more hip shots.
I mean, its name is is famous. I mean, everybody seems to know the name Checkpoint Charlie. Is that because of a movie, or did something happen there that was? Why is it on the minds of everyone?
I'm not sure exactly. I'm not sure exactly why it has that.
No,
name,
I don't know. But I do know that there were, I think, only two checkpoints that were right around there. Maybe it was the main one, like Brandenburg Gate was one. These were big entry and exit points, and I don't think
Brandenburg Gate was an actual checkpoint.
Oh, I thought it was, but I won't say for sure.
No, I don't recall there being a checkpoint there. I remember, and I went there at night. I spent a fair amount of time taking some really awesome night pictures with the extra exposure on the lighting of the the chariot on top of
and the horses,
the gate. Yeah, so I got some pretty cool pictures of that. So no, I think Checkpoint Charlie was one of the or the only entrance point.
It was
there might have been
one
others.
of the most important,
but one of the weird
used the traffic. Yeah,
most storified for sure, most storied. So one of the things that did happen though on that note is that later on, when I was staying in West Berlin, which, by the way, I was only there for like a week or something, and I got all kinds of stories to tell about that whole journey. I was traveling for around 8 months, and that whole journey, I could probably write a book of
Wow, these still
you know,
taking this
1,000
long
stories,
on.
something like that. That are, yeah, I can recount a lot of the
That's
details still,
great.
and that was you know, quite a few decades ago. So one of the things that did happen though is I was taking the subway from one point in Berlin to a distant point in Berlin, and I can't remember why, but I decided to get out at a certain stop, and it's kind of at the time it was kind of a neat ride because you
Wow.
went by decommissioned subway stations, right? So you're in the train, you're going underground, and there's all these decommissioned subway stations that you
Right.
know haven't been used since the Second World War, right? And nothing's been done to them. They're just still in time, right? So that was pretty cool. And then got to this certain station, and I left the station. I walked out into the street, and I realized I was in East Berlin, and I hadn't shown a passport. I hadn't done anything, and I just was hit with this kind of concern that I was somewhere I shouldn't be, and I probably shouldn't just wander around the streets. I should
Yeah.
get out of there before somebody says, "Show me your papers," right? So that somebody told me that was definitely possible at one point. But anyway, so the first place we went to, the two straight-laced kids from the UK and myself, we went to the radio tower, which is in the central square when you get across Checkpoint Charlie. It's not too far from there. And we went up the tower, took a good look around, and took some pictures, of course, and then came back down and sat in the cafe for a little while. And that was our first kind of stop, let's say. And because I had the long telephoto lens, I remember one of the people at the next table came over, and he didn't speak English at all, but we managed to communicate. And what I understood was he was a photographer, and he wanted to see my telephoto lens. I gave it to him to handle, and he looked through it, and he was amazed. He had never seen
Really?
through a telephoto lens,
Wow.
and he was a photographer, right? Because they weren't allowed to have telephoto lenses
Of
because
course.
you could use them for spying, right? So just these little things. And I remember the Black Forest cake that we had. It was terrible. It was like one day away from turning green.
And you're
Let's put it that
near
way.
the Black Forest.
Yeah. Yeah. You would think that Germans would have fresh and good Black
beer.
Forest cake. By the way, so we had a mission. When you went across the border, you had to convert, because of course the East German Deutschmark was worth nothing,
Yeah.
except for in its own country, right? So they had an interest in getting more Western funds. So you had to convert a West German Deutschmark
Right.
for an East German Deutschmark. You had to convert at least 5 when you went across the border. So we made it our mission to spend our 5 Deutschmarks, of course, which was very difficult. We throughout the day we went for 3 meals and a few drinks, and we didn't spend our 5 Deutschmarks. And a Deutschmark was 50 cents. So basically $2.50 at the time we couldn't spend in a day.
Oh, no.
So at that point when we were sitting around the tourist square, I looked at these two young men, and I said, you know, this is the tourist area. This is where the government is showing us everything they want to see in the best possible light. Why don't we just walk and see how far we could get, and walk into the suburbs, walk as far as we can, and check out the real East Berlin. So that was part of our adventure. And the other thing we were trying to do too was we were trying to get waiting staff to accept a tip, because tipping was illegal, because of course if you think of communism, it's capitalistic to work and get paid for your efforts, right?
Right.
You know, something along that kind of thinking, right? Everybody should be paid equally. The waitress shouldn't make more than the chef or the dishwasher, you know, this kind of idea. So jumping ahead to the end, just to finish that tipping story off, at the end we came back, and we
To the hostel.
Nightfall was falling. By the way, you couldn't stay overnight. You had to be
Right.
back by midnight across the border. You couldn't cross into
Right.
East Germany and stay overnight.
Okay.
You had to. It was just a day pass kind of idea. And so we noticed that that all the elite of East Germany, which there was a lot of elite there, that was a prime posting for Russians and for people in the Eastern Bloc, probably because it had such readily available
Mhm.
access to the Western world and West Berlin. And so finally, at the end of the day, I put a Deutschmark on a table so that a waitress could see it, and I tapped the Deutschmark, gave her a wink, kind of, and then she turned around, reached behind her back, picked up the coin, and it slid into her pocket. And then she kept walking like you would never have noticed it if you didn't know that was happening. So it was possible to tip in East Berlin, but it was on the sly.
That's great. Great story.
So some of the things we noticed when we were walking to the far side of town, number one, and I believe there's probably still remnants of this now. There was pot shots in the walls of the buildings, like were everywhere, like from gunshots from the Second World War. So there were pot marks on all the concrete buildings. You know, easy to find, like everywhere. A lot of the buildings hadn't been refurbished in West Berlin. There was a lot of refurbishment, and any buildings that were still showing signs of the Second World War, I believe, were maintained as memorials and historical buildings from the Second World War.
Apartment complexes?
No,
buildings.
No, just buildings that had been damaged in the Second World War.
As a testament to the war.
In West Berlin, I believe that's the case for any that may have been left, right? Like at Potsdamer Place, you know, this is going back a long way, so some of the names escape me. There's an old church that's been converted, and it's been actually turned into a memorial with some modern aspects added to it. But it's very famous. You'll see that on any pictures of Berlin. I just don't have all the information for it. So so that was one of the things we noticed, and one of the things we did, we stopped at a place for a schnapps. It was Friday afternoon, and it was Friday afternoon. Everybody was getting off work, so we went into this kind of a bar, and it was like stepping back in time. Everything was like stepping back in time. Okay, so imagine you go into this bar, and it's all older wooden tables, older chairs, a black and white checkered tile floor. So it's you know, you can just picture it. It's very 1940s, right? And it was packed with people that had all gotten off work. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, something like that. And we ended up talking to these two gentlemen who were sign writers, and we were talking in very broken English, like English they would have probably learned in the 50s and were trying to remember. And they were sign writers, and for people that don't know, sign writers, before computers, all the signs were drawn by hand, so it was quite an art. Anyway, they when they found out that we were from the West, it was like out of a movie. The one guy was looking at me and he said, America, Bill Haley, Elvis Presley. And he's making this airplane movement, right, of the airplane going over the ocean, right? And he's, you know, so his understanding of North America and Western culture was Elvis Presley and Bill Haley, which of course goes back to before the wall was built.
Yeah.
So their perception, what I took from that is that a lot of the perception of the West was dating back to the 50s, right? Even though it was the 80s, right. So it was like 30 years ago. Yeah, so it was quite interesting. So those are some of the little tidbits from my trip, Brent. Is there anything else? I wrote a little list of triggers here
Well,
to
no,
see
we
if there's
got about a
anything else
minute
that
left
I might
if
have
you wanna.
wanted to mention. Oh, sure. The other thing I should mention is that it was a national holiday. That the next day I believe was a national holiday, so there was a lot of ceremonial stuff set up, like stages
Right.
with flags, and all the flags were out, that kind of thing, and set up for speeches and for a parade. And at night there was, when we stayed at night, there was a bit of a
Uh-huh.
parade, but we didn't know what was going on. We had seen a lot of the flags were out, and we thought patriotism, some kind of holiday. We didn't really know. But in the
Oh,
evening,
that's the part
all the
of the
tanks
story
started
I
coming out on the
remember that I
street.
wanted you to tell.
Yeah, so we just sat back and
Yeah.
watched, but it wasn't the big parade like you see in Red Square. It was going to be something like that, I think, the next day. So I looked it up, and it was October 7th was their national day, which lines up with Munich Oktoberfest and everything. So it would have
Right.
been about the October the 6th or so that I was there. But that was quite fascinating to see too. It was fascinating, but a little
Yeah.
concerning because we didn't really know what was going on, and all of a sudden all these tanks and stuff are rolling around in the street. So we were kind of thinking, okay, let's hope this is
It
what we
was
think it is.
pre-Tiananmen too. You couldn't have had that as a
Yeah.
Tiananmen Square. Oh, if they had
In
opened
what way?
fire on protesters. No,
Yeah, but there was nothing like that.
no, it was all
There was no,
parade.
no, it was all,
Yeah.
yeah, it was all very good. Everybody was, if from what I remember, going back a long time, it's hard to remember people's facial expressions, but the people we talked to were all quite nice, but nobody went out of their way
Mhm.
until you broke some kind of
Mhm.
conversation, right? Broke into some
All
kind of
right, Bernie.
conversation.
Well, that's great to have those stories and to have you on 10-minute travels. Thank you very much for being a first guest.
Thanks, Brent. I hope you do more of
Thank
these,
you
and I wish
very
you luck with
much.
them. And if you want, we can tie in some of my other stories from other countries and
Perfect.
adventures.
All right, well, we'll have you on again. So this is Brent Entenson,
Sounds good, man.
and thank you for joining us on the first episode of 10-minute talks, travel talks. The name isn't solidified yet, and we'll see you on the next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.